I mean, you may notice that this talk may have different moods to it. I mean, some parts are very clearly worked out in detail. Other parts have been more or less constructed over the last couple of days when I was paying attention to the discussions that we were having here. So towards the end of the talk, you'll see me going more speculative. If you don't already think that I'm speculative at the beginning, well, I'm hyper-speculative at the end. So what I'm going to do then is to, first of all, raise the question of what do we mean by the body? I mean, what do we mean by embodiment? This buzzword that seems to be, you know, so much, you know, found everywhere, almost indiscriminately. And you sometimes have to stop and wonder and say, what are we talking about when we talk about embodiment? And I will give you two senses of embodiment. I mean, for the first part of the talk, I'll give you a very rough idea of what is the most common sense of embodiment in cognitive science today, and why something like the enactive life and mind approach would like to take some lessons from that kind of use of the word, but actually move away from it and provide what I would call a deeper sense of embodiment. And that will take me to a run through the main ideas of this life and mind enactive approach. And I suppose I'll be talking about autonomy and sense-making and transitions in the history of life and mind. And then towards the end, I'll just put on the table some ideas about habits, skills, and what I call the social flesh or the social invisible. As some of you may know, I mean, I have been over the past years working in using models, using evolutionary robotics models or computational simulations to try to ground some ideas and essentially to also have some kind of reality check. The models are there, and I could talk about them, and I just put them towards the end of the talk. I mean, I suppose that if we go into the discussion and someone is interested and say, like, well, but actually, this idea seems too abstract, can you actually build a model of this? Maybe we can go into that. But if I put them in the middle of the talk, it would be just too long, and we would just lose the track. But this is up to you as well, depending on what you want. I mean, we can talk about the models as well. So that's the overview. So let's start with then this question of the body and the different perspectives, and something that I call shallow embodiment, but actually I think I should find a better word, because I mean shallow in you know, all the negative overtones of that word. I don't really mean them. I just want to say that this sense of embodiment doesn't go far enough. So maybe you can help me find a better word. So you may be familiar with this picture that describes the brain, the body, and the environment in a mutual relation. Each of them describes as a little system having arrows moving back and forth the other bits of the system. So the brain connected to the body connected to the environment, and so on. And this is like, you know, I think this was first done by Randall Beer. It's a kind of iconic idea of embodied cognitive science, which is meant to tell us that the whole thing matters. You know, at the very least, you know, we should not be looking at brains in isolation from bodies, or bodies in isolation from the environment. But of course, there's a lot of room for interpretation or how we practically apply this idea. So let's take the case of perception as just one example of how embodied ideas have been moving progressively over the last few years. So I'll just make some caricatures of perception here. And in traditional cognitivism, traditional cognitive science, you have a picture like this. A little brain with a man there moving levers and pushing buttons and receiving some kind of image from the outside that is relayed from the sensors, such as, you know, ears and eyes into the brain. And of course, you know, when you show this picture to someone working in this traditional mode, they will say, like, oh, we don't mean that. Of course we don't. You know, that's such a caricature. But if you push them hard enough and you ask them, what do you mean by distributed representations? What do you mean by all this? Eventually, I always think it resolves into a version of this. Someone inside making interpretations of some translation that you have made of states of the world into internal representations. So that's the traditional caricature of perception. Now we've also been hearing a lot about what I call the sensory motor approach. Alva Noe and Kevin O'Regan idea of perception actually being a form of active engagement with the world, whereby your experience depends on your mastery of sensory motor contingencies and so on. So that's the other approach that you might call this. Okay, so I've got here this caricature again of, this is not necessary for you. You've seen this before. I mean, the softness of the sponge depends on how we grasp it and how we apply pressure and so on. And there's nothing in the sponge per se that you can call softness, but it's actually the result of this particular engagement of the body, in this case, a particular body, like someone with fingers, and the sponge itself, the responsiveness of the materiality of the world. The sponge is not going to be soft for an ant. So that's the idea of sensory motor contingencies. Perception in this view is therefore not separable from action, or not easily separable from action. And you could say that the particular form of the body, its disposition, becomes crucial in your abilities to perceive and act. So your skills become crucial. And I would like to then later on unpack some of these statements. Now, you can also say that this is a more situated approach because given that what you use in order to perceive is an engagement or even a virtual or potential engagement with the world, this engagement is likely to be the kind of engagement that is embedded into a network of everyday practices, like, for instance, drinking coffee. And you see this object, and you don't see an abstract object that then you suddenly realize, oh, by the way, I could actually pour some coffee and pick it up and drink it. You see a cup, and you see immediately what are the affordances of the cup. And then this is why you can say that this embodied approach is closer to Gibsonian ideas, because perception is a form of know-how, or for Heideggerian would be like some form of Zuhandenheit. Things are ready to hand. And because the materiality of your perceiving experience is the action itself, of course, it doesn't have to be added up later. This knowledge doesn't have to be added up later. It comes with the way that you perceive the world. So, in conclusion to this, discussing this approach, you can very well argue that we're talking about the crucial significance of the body in the whole of this approach. I mean, it's clear that the kind of perceptual experience you may have depends very much on the kinds of sensory motor engagements you can enact, and that depends on the body, on the structure of the body, on the history of the body, and so on and so forth. Now, why would I call this shallow embodiment? Well, one thing you may notice is that this story, nothing prevents in this story some kind of functionalist takeover and reappropriation of these ideas, whereby you say to a traditional functionalist theories in cognitive science for whom all that matters about cognition is how we implement different functions and put them together in order for the system to solve some problems. For a functionalist like Andy Clark, this is not bad news. I mean, this is fine. This is because precisely the body becomes one more element, one more information processing device available to the cognizer, and actually a very good and practical one, a very good embedded and dynamic and convenient sensory information processing device. So philosophers like Andy Clark external functionalists in general have seen the body as a welcome way of loading computation and so on. So this theory, I'm not saying Avanoy and Eric Mine and Kevin O'Regan would say that they probably wouldn't call themselves functionalists. I don't really care. What I mean is that the theory itself can be taken over, at least in this form, by the traditional point of view, and therefore more than a revolution, it's more like a reform. It's just saying, okay, we extend a little bit the possibilities for our story, make it more interesting and richer, but it's the same story, right? Now, the problem with that is that in this way, we're still avoiding certain questions. And these are the questions that traditional cognitive science has avoided all along. Some questions are in the blind spots. It's like some questions are questions that you cannot even ask from traditional points of view. Other questions are typically issues that people don't care too much about. And I've got a little list here. It's not exhaustive, but you can have questions about the nature of agency and the nature of autonomy, or the very nature of the identity of a cognitive system. I mean, what makes this a cognitive system as opposed to this plus the environment plus everything? And crucially, I believe, for a theory of cognition, the questions of meaning and value. I mean, what do we mean when we say, when we use words like meaning, value, etc.? So what happens is that many or all of these questions, I mean, none of them is really fully addressed, head on. And in a way, in a functionalist approach, what you do is to somehow assume that these questions will be answered in some way. So the questions of value, you for instance, you say, like, well, there must be some evolutionary story that tells me why this particular system is interested in doing mathematics, for instance. But that's actually like making science on credit, because I mean, nobody eventually may come with that story. And what will happen to your theory when it's revealed that that story is not there? So that's the situation, and I believe a fully fledged alternative paradigm in cognitive science should look head-on. I mean, just go and try to answer some of these questions. Try to just provide at least provisional definitions and check whether they make sense, whether they interlock in interesting ways and allow you to generate novel ideas or novel hypotheses. So that's the situation in embodied cognition. In most cases, if there is a meaning at all to the word embodiment, it tends to be this loosely functionalist meaning of the body is important, the body is crucial in some way. And that, I want to stress things here. I want to say that actually has generated very interesting lessons. I mean, it's not as if we have, I'm complaining that these people have done nothing. Actually, I am one of those people. I mean, my work in evolutionary robotics has mostly been about understanding how different bodily interactions with the environment can actually help you rethink what are the necessary mechanisms for a particular cognitive performance. So you can, some of the deep lessons from this is, for instance, that you have to stop thinking of mind as being something that happens in the head. It's actually something that happens in the interaction with the world. Other deep lessons have to do with considering mind not as some kind of discrete exchange of perception and action and so on, but actually something that happens extended over time. And if we go later to the models, I can show you very concrete cases of this. And of course, when we start looking at social cognition, we can also argue very concretely how mind cognition is happening not in the head of the individuals, but between them. The mind is in between people. So, just clarify that that's why I don't like the word shallow, but I couldn't find a better one. So this is then motivating me to start looking at the alternative, and that will take us to overview of this life and mind enactive approach. So, of course, I will be using the word enactive in a very particular sense, in the sense advocated by people like Francisco Varela, Evan Thompson, but different, as I already said, from people like Alva Noe, for instance. It's just a clarification that hope it is not a big issue. So where does the enactive story begin? It begins with experience. It begins with the realization that we ourselves, individually, we are beings who have an experience of concern with our lives, with our world, and so on. Things, to say it shortly, things matter to us. That's an interesting recognition. This is Hans Jonas, who wrote a very, very inspiring book on the phenomenon of life. I mean, he was an existential philosopher and trying to find the roots of existence. I mean, what is it to be a being? What is it to be something that exists? And he finds that in life itself. In a way, he says, funnily, that the success of an evolutionary view of the world, a Darwinian form of materialism that tells us that eventually, we have come from a history of blind material processes that have, operated under natural selection and et cetera, whatever version you want of evolution. That story that presumably would tell us, hey, we're nothing but atoms, actually it's a good story because it builds a bridge between nature, a continuity between nature and ourselves. But that bridge flows both ways, because we can also tell the story that since we cannot deny our own experience of concern, then we must be true that for other beings, they must have a kind of interiority, a form of life and things they care about. So, in that sense, Hans Jonas makes a very interesting, I call it metaphysical step. It's like, well, okay, we accept experience that leads us to believe in a material world and efficient forms of causation being dominant and so on. But we have to accept experience that we are alive. And that is the only way in which we can then understand living organisms as real, not as a way of speaking, which is something that goes back to Kant, which is like, organism seems to be self-organized and has intrinsic teleology, etc. But reason, pure reason cannot approach that. So we have to use that as kind of a regulative knowledge. Hans Jonas says, no, this is real knowledge. And why life? I mean, why not go up to rocks and everything? And the argument goes like this. For Hans Jonas, metabolism is a particularly interesting sort of entity because it's a formal identity, something that is being conserved in a material flux. So there's a flux of matter and energy that conserves a form, and that form has a consequence, which is it acts so as to conserve itself. That would be one way to put it, or it conserves itself as a consequence of its actions. That would be another way to put it. So the only time where you as living organisms coincide with the matter in your bodies is when you're dead. Yeah. That's the only time where there is a coincidence, a material permanence of this body, this piece of matter. And life is precisely the sustenance of an identity that is not material in itself, it's formal and dynamic. And that puts Hans Jonas in a position to start making an argument that, therefore, the relations that this system has with the world are relations of you may call it of interest, of concern, that it's better to get, over here where there is protection than to go over there where there is danger, because I'm trying to conserve myself. It's better to get some nutrients than to get some poison into your body, because I am this particular form of self-conserving identity that needs this sort of food, and so on. So that's the rough philosophical argument. And the question is, for the enactive approach, to try to take that into and make it into a piece of science and see, can we express it scientifically? So the idea is that there have been attempts to do this using the notion of autopoiesis, which you've heard about and many of you already know about, which tells the story of the defining features of a living organism being its continuation, its self-production. So you have a network of molecular components that constitute a bounded system, and the bounded system is what allows those chemical reactions to continue while the system is receiving inputs and outputting waste products into the environment. So the typical example of autopoiesis is a cell, where you can draw all these arrows and say, like, look, these things depend on this, I'm going to come back to this, and therefore there is a kind of a closed organization, not a closed system, but a closed organization of the system. And you can see similar forms of closed organization at other levels. And we spoke of the immune system, but I think it was over dinner. That's one possibility. The nervous system also, if you see it as a network of relations of changes of activity between neurons and so on, that itself depends on previous forms of structures that were specifying different forms of activity and so on and so forth. So it's a kind of circular relation within the activity of the nervous system, and also in the sensory motor coupling as well, in the action perception loops. So we'll go a bit more and more into detail in a minute, but this is the kind of idea that's trying to translate Hans Jonas' very, almost poetic point of we are living beings, we can understand life, life is a formal form of entity, and therefore, because it's precarious and it's under threat, it engages with the world in what you might call mindful ways. That kind of story, can we make a translation of that into operational concepts? And this is the starting point for one option to try to make that story, to cash out that story. And Francisco Varela, in one of his latest papers with Andreas Weber, he proposes that there is a kind of logical progression from the idea of autopoiesis to the idea of sense-making. I'm going to say what sense-making means in a second. And that is the way in which you can articulate Hans Jonas's argument into a scientific story. Because if you have an autopoietic system, the system will engage with the world in ways that will either affect the autopoiesis in a good way or in a bad way, and therefore those engagements will be appreciated by the system itself, not in a kind of mentalistic sense of the system looking at itself, but more like the actual changes are themselves an appreciation of that exchange with the world, and the appreciation will be either like things are good or things are bad, like minor or major breakdowns in autopoiesis that may occur as a consequence of certain forms of exchanges with the world. So he said that would be a way of saying that the system is cognizing, in some very broad sense we're talking about here, cognizing about the world by itself being affected positively or negatively in its interactions with the world. The idea by itself doesn't quite work because you need an extra concept, which is the concept of adaptivity, which is, and it's not included in autopoiesis itself. It's not included in the dynamics of self-conservation or self-production of the autopoietic system. Anything that says that that system will just seek out, say, conditions that will make it live a better life, or avoid conditions that will make it, sorry, there was a question. Or avoid conditions that will make it, you know, run some risk of time. There's no way in which a system can know that this is autopoietic until the very moment, that it ceases to be autopoietic until the very last moment. You throw yourself off a cliff, and you're alive, and you're still alive, until the very, very last second, you're still alive. And so if the normativity is whether you're alive or not, you cannot distinguish such a situation from not throwing yourself off a cliff. So you need something else that tells you, that allows you to regulate interactions in terms of the potential consequences for your own self-sustaining organization. So that's the property of adaptivity. We may go into it in some detail if you want, but I just want to keep it at a sort of a medium flight level. It's just going through the concepts, and then we can come back if necessary. So then sense-making, which would be the appreciation of whether an exchange with the world is valent, it has a positive or negative valence, or is something that you should seek or avoid. That is the value of those exchanges as a consequence for your own self-sustaining organization would require first an identity that is self-sustaining, in this case autopoiesis, plus adaptivity, mechanisms that allow you to regulate your interactions with the world and your internal organization with respect to how things are going. So I just want then to move to the notion of autonomy. All this, I should say by the way, I mean, for some of you, this will be familiar because I end up running through these central concepts of enactive theory always during 1/3 of the talk and so on, and then move on to something new. So I apologize if you've seen these slides. We're trying to understand autonomy. It was one of those questions that we said needed to be addressed. So we speak about cognitive agents, cognitive systems being autonomous. And what do we mean by that? We certainly do not mean that they're independent of the world, that they are unconditioned. That's not what we mean. What we mean is that there is a sense in which you can speak of that system giving itself its own laws, or its own norms would be even better. But how is that possible? I mean, if you have a system that you have designed yourself, that system will follow the laws of the designer, or in this case you. So the only way in which a system could follow a certain, to have a say in its own laws would be that the system is able to modify or change itself. Or better, the system is able to construct itself as an entity. So by autonomy, then, what is required, what we have to have, is something that is a self-sustaining process of identity generation. And I will cash this out. A self-sustaining process of identity generation under precarious conditions. Classical example, autopoiesis. Life is self-sustaining, is constructing itself. You may call this closed network an identity because the closed network of processes allow you to tell you whether a particular process belongs or does not belong to the system. And that allows you to say, like, well, this is a system, and you can follow that system over time. That's why we use the word identity here. And there may be other, and there are indeed other levels in which this same dynamic obtains, you know, when at the personal level, interpersonal level, etc. Now, what is the consequence of trying to work with our operational concept of autonomy? And I'm going to show you why it's an operational concept. Well, one consequence is that we make, in this case, mine or the individual cognizer, we make this into an irreducible level of inquiry. Most of psychology, cognitive science, neuroscience, it's very comfortable discussing what happens under the level of the individual, you know, below the individual level. So at the subpersonal level of drives and motivations or neural function, etc. Or it's also very comfortable talking about what happens above that level, the evolutionary histories, relations with your parents, etc., etc. So there is a lack of a proper thematization of the level of the individual mind. And it's funny because it's the same situation happens in biology. In biology, the organism itself is a kind of a vanishing entity. You know, that it may be referred to at the beginning of a paper in biology, talk about organisms, but immediately you just stop talking about organisms, start talking about genes, or start talking about selective pressures. But it's hard to keep this entity there as a proper level of analysis. And that actually changes the way we can start looking at cognitive science, because now cognitive science has been slightly, you know, widened, not just into the science that tries to say how does a cognitive system work, but also into the science that says what makes a system cognitive, what makes a system mindful, what are we talking about, what is the difference between that and other forms of systems, you know, a car. Why would you call this system mindful and not that one, right? That is also part of the questions that we ask in this form of inquiry and cognition. So, I said I was going to go a bit deeper into the idea of autonomy. There is a definition of autonomy that is there, which is long and wordy and so on. I have worked to, you know, every comma of it. I've tried to just make sure that, you know, all the cases we want in are in, and all the cases that we don't want are not there, and so on. But I think I can illustrate this in a different way. And again, I hope you can see that. Well, okay, not too well. Here, you've got an illustration. You imagine yourself, you're in a laboratory, and you're measuring different things. You've got different instruments, and you're observing different forms of processes. And here, I have a picture of several blobs here, not ordered in any particular way, representing those things that you're looking at. You're looking at the temperature of a machine, you're looking at a chemical reaction, whatever. So each one of those processes that you're observing is represented by a blob. What is not so clear because of the light here is that there are some very tiny arrows connecting some of these blobs, going from one blob to another. It's okay, it doesn't matter if you don't see this. There's some arrows going from some blobs to another, meaning that you have made the following observation, that whenever something happens to one of these blobs, when you intervene, you change it, there is a consequent, you know, event that happens in the other blob. Then you draw an arrow. There is some relation of conditioning that says that, well, you know, I seem to be changing, you know, the pressure here, and I see the temperature rising. Okay, draw an arrow between the blob about pressure and the blob that describes temperature. So, you know, you're observing so far things. And at some point, or typically what we do, sometimes is we select a series of these observations, these variables, and we call it a system for some convenient purpose. For instance, you know, you're working with a robot, and you know, you call that collection of metal, electronics, wires, and rubber wheels, you call that a robot. Right, so you as an observer are saying, this is my system, right? And so you work in this way by just ascribing some kind of wholeness to a part of the world, which is, you do it in a convenient way. You do it in a way that allows you to exchange ideas, to work with it, and that's perfectly fine. That's what we typically do. But if you want to understand autonomy, you cannot do this, because as I said, you cannot just take the point of view of the designer and decide this is going to be the autonomous system. By doing that, you are undermining the very concept of autonomy. So you have to do something else. You have to keep observing this world. And you may find, now you can see arrows. You may find that a subset of these observations relate to itself in a very funny way. You may find blobs that receive arrows from other blobs and contribute arrows to other blobs. That is to say, processes that are conditioned by other processes in this subset of all your observations, and at the same time contribute to the conditioning of these processes in the same subset. Once this subset becomes closed on itself, that's when you're talking about an autonomous system. One caveat, one additional thing that is not in the figure, the precariousness. That is to say, you also realize when you're observing this system that not only these things are organized in a closed manner, all these arrows pointing to processes that are themselves inside the subset, but the fact that they are organized in this way is also necessary for each of these processes to carry on existing. That is to say, if you start to intervene in this organization, suddenly you will see that these processes just break down. They're sustained in a way by the way they are related to each other. That's interesting, and as I said before, that describes an operationally closed organization, but that doesn't not imply that the system is unconnected to other things in the world. So there are still arrows that go in and out processes that belong to this subset, but those arrows that go out go to some process that doesn't come back. So you can say, for instance, well, trees, plants depend on sunlight for their subsistence. So there will be an arrow there from the sun into the plant. But the sun doesn't depend on the plants for its own existence. So there is no arrow going back. So that's what these things mean. The system is open to the world, but it's operationally closed. Its organization is an organization of closed networks of dependencies. So this idea of autonomy, we will apply this several times in the next part of the talk. One thing that I have to say, because I mentioned this idea of precariousness, and this is here that actually we sort of part ways with traditional ways of doing cognitive science. First of all, because this idea of precariousness is the recognition that all these systems are operating in a far from equilibrium condition. They're not just inert. And all the elements in this system, all the processes, components, and so on, can only be sustained if in the presence of the whole. And that is to say that they are precarious. Now, precariousness is not to be understood as a positive property of matter. It's not to be understood as something that you can simulate or put in a box and say like, oh, I'll make my robot a bit precarious by just inserting a little component there that makes it, that says how precarious it is. Because precariousness is precisely the opposite. It's a lack of permanence of any positive property that you could ascribe to a function, right? So you've got a neural, you've got a neuron, and you describe the transfer function of that neuron by saying, oh, okay, there's synapses, there's activation coming in, some processes inside, and then, pulses, thrown, via the axon towards other neurons and so on. So there's a transfer function there, and in connectionist models, you typically, you describe it as a sigmoid or whatever it is. That function is precarious in the sense that it is conditioned on many other things. That's an example. And you can only treat it as a function in a way that it has limitation. It won't be the same function always, or it won't be there always. That means, in a deep sense, that there is an aspect of materiality that, in this story, allows systems to become autonomous and therefore to become cognitive. So, an autonomous system is necessarily a material system. And we're going to try to explain what that means, because you may find that later contradicts other things I'm going to say. I'm going to not say anything there. Okay. Now, I just want to clarify this idea of autonomous organization. By trying to move away from a style of thinking that already happens within autopoietic theory, which is the idea that, okay, you've got a system that is organized in such a way where all the elements are contributing to the whole, and in a way they survive thanks to their contributions to the whole. Each organ that is fulfilling a function in your body that helps other organs survive and so help the whole survive. So imagine that you've got nothing. This is, okay, you've got a circle sort of fitting back on itself, trying to signify this idea of operational closure. Now, you've got several components in this circle, the action of each of these processes, all of them more or less feeding back on themselves. You just start following, say, in an organism, the function of a particular organ and say, why is this organ doing this? Well, it's providing, oxygen to the blood flow, blah, blah, blah. Why? Because that's going to be transported to, sort of cells, etc., etc. And you keep asking, what's going on? And eventually you close back on the beginning, right? So this relation of closure. And you may think that this is a kind of each process contributing, doing their best to keep the whole going. And this is a way of looking at considering life as sustaining itself, as being life as self-maintenance. And this is a typical way that you find in the autopoietic literature. Now, I want to suggest that the same understanding can be, the same understanding of a system that keeps going can be made in a different way, whereby each of these processes has a natural tendency to destroy the system. Each of these processes has a natural tendency that if you were to leave your heart do what it really wants to do, it will just kill you. And the thing is that these tendencies are negated or overcome by the action of other parts of the system that say, like, okay, no, stop heart, you're not doing this. Now I will do something else here to prevent you from killing us, and so on. But the same process that does that, if it were to have its way, it will kill you. And so you can understand many diseases as precisely the misfunction of this organization, like in case of autoimmune diseases, cancer, etc. They are indeed parts that can get away with what they really would do normally. And there in this light, life is a kind of a frustrated suicide. You have a system that is by nature trying to, in each of these components, run away and disintegrate the system, but it's organized in such a way that it cannot. And why is this an interesting alternative way of looking at it? Because at the end you also obtain the circular organization, and that's it. Well, it's an interesting way of looking at it because it implies an inherent restlessness, an inherent motivation to move, because things are in this unstable condition all the time. You're never in a condition where you might say like, okay, everything's fine. You know, that condition that you might sometimes experience, in fact, has a limitation. At some point, everything is not fine anymore. Why? Well, you know, because there is an internal negativity. And not to mention something I'll mention later, an external negativity as well. So, I don't know how I'm doing with time, John.
It's 11:20, so you have the session. We have 1 hour to go.
Okay, thanks. I'm okay. I'm halfway more or less. So let's come back to the point that we were trying to make. The point that we were trying to make was that there could be a way of grounding the idea of cognition in the autonomy of living organisms, or more simply, in autonomy. And Hans Jonas says there's an existential kind of argument for that. Francisco Varela said, yes, there's a logical progression that takes you from autopoiesis to something called sense-making. Now, I've already spoke about autonomy. Now that we have something like a concept of autonomy and operational closure, can we now proceed and say, look, it's obvious if you follow logically the consequences of this idea, you already have a system that is related to the world in terms of meaning, in terms of norms. Well, as I said, you know, having a self-sustained identity implies already a normativity because, well, at least to the external observer, you can say that some interactions between this system and its environment will be good in the sense that it will keep sustaining the identity, or will be bad in the sense that they don't. Interestingly, you have to compare that to other physical systems. You know, you look at a planet and say, you know, a particular, two planets collide. Is it good or bad? For the planets, we don't have a way to say that there is a value attached to whatever happens, to whatever event happens in this physical system. Whereas we can say that of the living, about the living organism. The interesting thing is that if that organism has enough mechanisms to appreciate some of these consequences by itself and act on the tendencies of a particular encounter, then that organism itself is able to modulate its changes, modulate its behavior, when it's, well, I'll not speak of behavior yet, modulate its interactions with the world, so as to, for instance, select a pathway that leads to improve autonomy or improve autopoiesis. And this is what I call sense-making. So imagine here you have like a closed diagram. Sorry. Yes, I said at the beginning that at least to the external observer, there is a normativity to whether this system is interacting with the world in this way or that way. And now I'm saying that if it becomes available to the organism in some limited form, not necessarily in a full-blown objective manner, for instance, but just mainly, you know that, for instance, by investigating this particular form of bacteria, you know that sugar is good and medium temperatures are good. But it may happen that that system can only detect sugar and ignore temperature. It doesn't really have the mechanisms to know that medium temperature is good. And sometimes if you put sugar at a very high temperature, it will just go there and eventually die because of the high temperatures. You will say like, aha, silly, you didn't know. But it's essentially what I mean is it doesn't matter. I mean, at least as there is some access of that organisms to all this multidimensional normativity that will that you can use to describe whether the organism will live or not, that organism is doing some form of sense making. And of course, will be more sophisticated if you can tell the difference between temperature as well. So first, external observer to make the point that the normativity, that we can't speak of normativity at all. And now highlighting that the organism itself has to make that difference. And how? I mean, I was going to say it here. Imagine this, there's a closed set here, this, that you might describe in a space of possible states of the organism. And this closed set describes the domain of viability of the organism. So that is to say, if you're inside this closed space, if the organism state is inside, you're alive. If you cross it, you're dead. You know, for instance, if your blood pressure goes above, or your body temperature goes above a certain level, you die. Now, this domain of viability, you know, the organism is not in a single point there, it's moving about. So this is what the arrow represents. And if you cross that domain, that boundary, the organism disappears. Now, a sense-making organism is an adaptive organism that is able to revert a tendency that tends to make it approach the boundary of viability. Things are getting dangerous, and things are getting more and more, they leave less and less options. If there is a mechanism that allows the organisms to alter its behavior or its internal working, as this starts to happen and avoid the crossing of the boundary, that organism is doing sense-making. So this implies that it's a kind of an adaptive monitoring and regulation of states of the system and, of course, of states of the system-environment relation. So, and the result is that there is an avoidance of the crossing of the boundary in trajectories that would otherwise cross the boundary. Now, another of these questions that we raised before, the question of agency, derives directly from these two concepts of autonomy and sense-making. What are the requirements for agency? I mean, why do you call something an agent? I mean, in normal language. Well, we worked on this, and we identified that there were typically 3 requirements that would be the same across the board in all possible meanings of agency, only that sometimes some of these requirements were more important than others. And these requirements are the idea of individuality, asymmetry, and normativity. We speak of agency as agents as an individual entity. So there has to be a notion of individuality. But also we speak of agents as doing things, of being agents, you know, this kind of active element, doing things in the world. So if they're in their coupling with the environment, there is an asymmetry, at least sometimes, not all the times, an asymmetry between you know, the arrows that go back from the agent into the environment and back. Because the agent is it's behaving, it's doing something in the world. We want to capture that. And there is a normativity to it, because the agent is not doing just random things, it's doing things with certain normativity, for instance, trying to find some food. Now, you can put all these requirements together, and it follows very simply from what we already said about autonomy and sense-making, that if you have a sense-making system that is able to regulate its interactions with the world, its coupling with the world, that in itself already fulfills these 3 requirements. So you've got a system that is autonomous and precarious, that is able to make sense of its interactions with the world and regulate its interactions with the world. For instance, a cell is able to open and close ion channels. Bacteria is able to move from one environment which is low in sugar to one that is rich in sugar. So those changes of the conditions of the interactions with the world that originate in the system itself are the actions of an agent. And this is how we approach the question of agency. So you've got a system like an espresso machine that is not an agent. It doesn't fulfill these requirements. You know, a toy car is not an agent. A toy car that is supposed to run with water. If you collect water and you make it go into the rain, approaching a kind of a gray area there, right? We can discuss that. A cell, yes, we're already a cell that is able to regulate interactions with the environment, opening and closing ion channels. That is an agent. An animal, like a dog, is an agent, and you know, there could be different sizes of agency. So agency is not manifested necessarily by looking at the agent and seeing that it's doing what it wants. Actually, agency often is manifested as something that the system is trying to do and not achieving it, right? So you've got a dog on a leash there. Agency may be ambiguous between moments of acting and moments of being passive, and it may imply a sort of a social element as well. You know, you are agent in the presence of others, and we'll come to that. And eventually, the regulations of agency, you can reappropriate them and regulate yourself in some way. Trying to signify that with that. So the point here is that agency, you have this very minimal definition of agency, but that still allows for very different kinds of sophisticated distinctions within this notion of agency. So now, this approach then is trying to cover a lot of ground, and it's trying to have a kind of a naturalization of many of the terminologies, much of the terminology that we use in cognitive science. And this is a story that is not over yet, and you can investigate transitions in different forms of operational forms of autonomy and agency. And I've got two columns here, one describing autopoiesis, adaptivity, regulation, nervous system, image making, blah, blah, blah. They follow some of the suggestions by Hans Jonas himself about the different transitions in value making with the history of life. And on this side, you have if you like, the teleological, you know, cognitive aspect of things. So Hans, you could claim that things like actions and emotions only come when you have some form of self-movement. I'm going to go back to that. Or the idea of objectivity comes when we are able to do our first images, and so on and so forth. And each of these blobs here would take a whole lecture, really. But one thing you notice is that there is a kind of axis of increasing autonomy, or increasing forms of sophisticated autonomy, and increasing forms of mediacy. Increasing form of the object of cognition becomes further and further removed. Instead of just surviving and just evaluating whatever comes into contact with the cell wall, you can, at the bottom of this, have a human project and say, like, well, you know, I would like to be an academic, and therefore I will plan the best way to do it, and so I would like to be a good father. And so it's good. There's a whole range of increasing forms of mediacy between your actions, your situation, and, if you like, the cognitive target of your performance. So I don't think I may have too much time for this, but I wanted to just move into the habit thing. But this is something I just said very briefly about how animality is about a kind of a self-movement and a spatial know-how, by which I mean that you have to have some kind of proprioception, some kind of knowledge that you're moving. Presumably, you know, a bacterium going up a sugar gradient doesn't know that it's moving. It's just moving, but as far as the mechanisms for sense-making that it has, it may as well be just turning the sugar volume up, so to speak, instead of really moving to the source of sugar. So there's no distinction that tells that system that it is moving. But for an animal, for instance, and I don't want to go into the discussion whether plants are cognitive. Yes, they are, and they move and all that. But what I want to say is that there is this qualitative jump here when you're able to uproot yourself and move about, because then a whole spectrum of intentional possibilities open up, whereby some form of life like bacteria might have some kind of internal tension between need and satisfaction when it needs a particular nutrient, an animal can have a much more sophisticated form of development of this intentional space, because, for instance, an animal is able to move and perceive at a distance something that hasn't happened yet. I mean, you can say like, oh, the predator is over there, and therefore I should better run. So now I am appreciating something that hasn't happened and is about to happen. Or similarly, oh, I can see the tracks of my prey, and I know then I might just find it if I just start running. So I can project into the future or understand the immediate past because I can move. And that what was originally something like just some very one-dimensional between need and satisfaction, now it becomes much more sophisticated, something like you may have emotions like fear, which is, you know, that there is danger that is, you know, impinging on me, but not here yet, or expectation, and so on and so forth. So Hans Jonas makes this argument, very nice argument of how emotion comes with action and perception. So this is a part of the story when I'm just giving you these vignettes. All of them would probably need a proper development and surely need a proper development. But I'm just trying to give you this overall picture of what might look like a program, alternative to the functionalist program. For Hans Jonas, these transitions that we talked about, say transitions to forms of self-movement, are transitions whereby you get some gain in the sense of you are able to regulate your interactions with an increased freedom and increased autonomy, but at the same time in a more precarious manner. So he speaks about needful freedom. So for instance, you can move about and have some freedom if you're an animal, but you have less guarantee that you're going to get the energy resources that you need to carry on surviving. Like a plant who has just to stand there and just wait for the sunlight and the air and the earth. So there is no net gain in these transitions. It's not that there is an evolutionary tendency towards more and more complexity and complex forms of autonomy, but the thing is that once they happen, they start conserving that made them happen. That is to say, the perceiving animal starts to conserve an identity that involves acting in the world and perceiving in the relation of perception. So there is therefore a way in which you can say that every time these transitions happen, it's a new form of life that is beginning to be conserved or is being born, of course, as in a continuation from previous ones. I didn't say much about social interaction, and just flagging here the fact that this can be applied to social interaction as well, and this is work we've done with Hannah de Jager. And you can, and also given connecting to things that John has also worked on. One of the terms that you haven't defined properly in cognition is the social, and that's one that when you look for definitions and you're lucky to find one, you find circular definitions such as, the study of information processing in a social setting is referred to as social cognition. That's by Chris Frith. We propose something different. We propose to understand social cognition as a mutual co-regulated coupling between two autonomous agents. So I'm using all these words. I'm using autonomy, coupling, agents, which I have already defined. Which in addition, it's not just a mutual co-regulated coupling, but in addition, that coupling acquires a sort of autonomy of itself, of its own. And this is characterized in circumstances where we're interacting with people. Two interactors are interacting, and actually they don't want to interact, and they keep on interacting. Such as, for instance, in the narrow corridor situation, when you just step and say, oh, sorry, oh, sorry, oh, sorry, and you're still coordinating with each other, and your individual intention is actually to just pass through. Well, the interaction is taking over there for a little while, and having a kind of temporary form of autonomy. And the sense-making that happens in these conditions we call participatory sense-making. And again, this is the subject of a full different talk, but I'll come back to that in a minute about when I go back to the social aspects of habits. Time?
35 minutes.
Okay, I'll be laughing. Okay.
Well,
Yeah, no, I'm going to finish
no
soon.
problem. I mean, because I'm sure there'll be questions.
Yeah, I don't have a lot more, but this is now, it's start to move towards the more speculative. I mean, this is closing up this whole, put it on the table, all these concepts. Autonomy, agent, sense-making, participatory sense-making, transitions in forms of autonomy. But then, of course, there is a question that you can ask immediately and say, like, well, isn't this approach something that eventually says that everything is about surviving as an organism? You know, all these values that you speak about and say, like, when things are good or bad, are they not all eventually related to the autopoiesis of the organism? And isn't that not contradictory with our experience? Because sometimes we care about things that are not necessarily our own physical survival. We care about other people, we care about things outside ourselves, we care about a country, whatever. So what is now, there's a missing concept there that we need. And I would like to propose that this concept should be the concept of a habit. Now, we don't speak so much about habits in cognitive science and psychology because the recent history of the concept is a bit tainted by the use of this word in behaviorism and such things. But actually, the concept of a habit, it can be quite rich. And if you look backwards in time and how it has been used, you have people who go from Aristotle first, and I forgot to mention him, and to Hegel, Maine de Biran, Félix Ravesson, to sort of philosophical psychologists like Kurt Goldstein, pragmatists like John Dewey, William James, and phenomenologists like Merleau-Ponty. And then psychologists in the middle of the century, last century, like Nikolai Bernstein's understanding the self-organization of the movement of the body, or Ivo Koller, who was running experiments on disruptions to visual perception using inverting goggles and so on. They all use this concept of a habit. Not in exactly the same way, but they had, you know, they had that concept in some kind of high regard, in the sense of it is the habit that actually makes the difference, and in particular the difference, certain forms of habits make the difference between animal life and human life. We can come back to that. But so what is a habit? I mean, how should we understand it? As you probably notice, what I'm interested in is to, when you take a word like this, to try to find an operational definition, a way of grounding it such that you be able to then describe it without using terminology that it hasn't been grounded in this way already. So you can describe a habit as some kind of ecological entity, and I want to explain what I mean, that sets itself into some kind of stable pattern, and in the case of a cognitive agent, a stable pattern of action and perception. So the idea is like this. I mean, you have a system that is plastic, not just the cognitive agent, but also the environment itself is plastic in the sense that there are changes that can happen over slow timescales that tend to be conserved. And that system is behaving. There's a kind of an underlying structure, but that structure produces certain forms of behavior, maybe at a faster timescale. Now, the thing is that the plasticity, the plastic changes will affect the behavior, but the behavior itself, because this plasticity is dependent on the processes that are going on, this plasticity is induced by behavior. So there's a kind of a circular relation between the processes that happen at a fast time scale and the processes that happen at a slow time scale, like dynamics and metadynamics. And the slow processes are not just slow, but actually they're altering the structure of a system. It's as if you have a set of differential equations and you say, like, well, I want to understand whether this is going to fall into a particular attractor and so on. That's the dynamics. But the plastic processes are actually changes in those equations, changes in those parameters, adding an equation, removing another, and so on. That is the plastic metadynamical process. When that happens, and this circularity is not guaranteed to ever stop, but when this circularity tends to fall into some kind of metastable condition, that's when you have a habit, something that is, in a way, already predisposed to continue itself, some kind of autonomous ecological dynamics. And this is an example here. You see here a path on the grass that is there and regulates the walking of people. I mean, we walked yesterday, but actually the one that we did yesterday probably was not made like this. It was probably man-made. I mean, intentionally made. I mean, let's do it like here. But this can happen naturally. There is a path on the grass that is made by the walking. It's a path made by walking. Now, once the path is there, you tend to walk along the path, thereby reinforcing the path and preventing the grass from regrowing. But the structure that looks very, very stable, and it is, but it's not fixed in time. It has a certain reactivity, because if someone puts here, you know, like an ice cream, you know, shop here, people will start deviating from the path to reach this new destination, and eventually forming a new path or a network, or changing this path and so on. So this kind of dynamics is what I try to call what I think characterizes a habit. Now, here I've got the typical map of somatosensory in somatosensory cortex. When you have represented all these parts of the body, you know, when you touch a finger and so on, and a neuron over here lights up, you touch your face and a neuron over there lights up. And I want to suggest that actually this somatosensory map is actually one case of this path. What you have is a somatosensory path making, because it is made by the activity. The doing things actually, by Hebbian learning is enough to explain how certain things become activated and how they leave a trace in the brain that then allow you to do things in the same way. So these are the neural underpinnings of the plasticity required for habits. But I must just say that actually the plasticity doesn't have to be in the organism. It can be in the environment too. And this it's a very nice story told by Philip Agri, who's one pioneer of situated artificial intelligence, where he says that he has a record collection in his office, and he likes to listen to just one side of each record. He has like a preferred side of each record. So he moved into the office. He moved first time and put all the records there on a shelf. And over a period of some weeks, he noticed something interesting, that he would pick a record and take it out of the sleeve, and immediately would come out in such a way that he could just do this movement, just take the record and directly, boom, onto the record player, and it was the right side. He didn't have to choose. So he realized that the whole activity was reorganizing the way in which the records were being put back into the sleeves, in such a way that it would be easier for him to take them out and put them back when he wanted to listen to them. And he did this totally unconsciously and so on. I mean, it just happened, but it is a case in which the plasticity is in the record collection itself. It has been modified by action such that now it perpetuates certain forms of action, listening to the sides that he likes. These changes in somatosensory cortex can actually be, you can intervene with this by, for instance, using tools. And you can see how if you're trained to use a tool to grasp something, then you have different appreciation of your body schema. You think actually that the distances between parts of your arm have become smaller or larger, depending on how you do it, and so on. This is recent work by Cardinali and others, where you train someone to pick up something with a tool, and then they have a sense of an enlarged arm, but then the parts to make it fit with the rest of the body, then parts of this enlarged arm seem to have contracted and so on, and they can measure this.
Can you just explain what's being grabbed there?
What's being grabbed?
Yeah, I don't know.
It's I think it's a little cube, and it's either you grasp it with your hand like this.
What I mean is,
Oh.
the histogram.
Yeah, sorry. These are latencies and pre and post test conditions without the tool, so that they measure acceleration. I didn't want to go into the details, but measure acceleration, velocity, and so on, showing that having been trained to grasp with the tool, therefore taking a longer arm, then when you remove the tool, it takes you longer because you already expect to reach much before you actually reach. The tool has given you the expectation to just get to your goal much quicker. So when I'm using the tool, I can do this and I already touch this part of the table, and then I'm doing this, and then I have to carry on. So that's what they're measuring, the extra time that it takes.
So the orange bars are the times measured with the tool, and the green?
No, there are pre and post tests without the tool, and the middle is having been trained with the tool. I mean, so you measure the same thing, essentially, grasp without the tool, and there is an after effect of having been trained to use the tool.
Not to slow down, but I just don't know what those axes are. So what's the ordinate? What's the measure?
This is latencies. This is time and time to reach a particular acceleration in the profile of movement, time towards reaching a particular velocity. So they measure these points like the peak velocity or the peak acceleration, and so on. And these are significant differences. That it takes you longer to reach these points after being trained by the tool, because in a way your movement has been reorganized to having a tool in your hand, and now they're taking the tool from your hand, and initially you just think that the only thing you need to do is what you just done with the tool, but if actually that's not enough, so you need to then carry on. So it takes longer time to reach this point in the profile of velocity and acceleration.
So what's being measured as velocity? I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't want to slow you down here, but
It's here acceleration, velocity. Here I can't tell very well, sorry. And also what is measured here is subjective point. They point to parts of the arm. So they touch, they're blindfolded and they touch a bit of the arm, and it says, touch this bit, touch that. Someone touches parts of the arm and they say, well, point to where that is, roughly. And you point like this or like that, you're blindfolded. And their perception of the arm has, in certain distances, feel like the arm has shrink. So they say that it's a concept, I don't want to make a big point about this particular experiment. I want to say that it has, the use of a tool changes the habit and therefore has changes in the body schema and in somatosensory cortex as well. You can postulate that as a hypothesis. The concept of habit is very rich, and you cannot see this very well, but we've been trying to trace all the connections between all these people, going back to Aristotle, some Arabic, thinkers, and Ibn Tufal, back towards, through Hume, Dewey, it's just too rich. That's the problem. We started making these connections, and then we realized that we didn't have enough dimensions to connect them all. But there are different breaks in the idea of habit when you say, like, no, the habit is a bad word you shouldn't use. But different lines of thinking and connection, like here's main Debiron, Hegel, and so on, leading up to the Gestalt school, connecting to phenomenology via Merleau-Ponty, and et cetera, et cetera. It's such a rich concept that it's actually quite difficult to put all this together and to try to make a clear sense of it. But people have said extreme things about habits, such as, for instance, Hegel says habits is what prevents us from going mad, right? Things, thanks to the fact that we had habits, we just don't go crazy because we can just, without a habit, you know, the mind would just either close on itself and become totally, you know, disconnected with the world and obsessed with itself, or it would be just totally driven by whatever distraction it has and be so open to the world that nothing will happen. I will be constantly, you know, anxiously changing from one thing to the next. And it's actually the habit is what puts some order in that. And so it's like, okay, you can focus on certain things. They're not in yourself, they're connected to yourself, but this focusing actually helps you to just keep out all the other noise. And that's, you know, then I haven't got it here. Well, Hume, Deleuze, and it's not even there. He says, you know, the habit, the self is a collection of habits. So I propose that this is a very rich concept that needs to be, you know, worked out even further. That habits themselves can generate values because, in the sense, in a way, if you have this circularity of processes that change and sustain themselves, they generate certain predispositions to carry on, you know, enacting the same habits. And for this, some things are good or some things are bad. So the habit of smoking, you know, is in itself bad only with respect to a larger objective point of view, but in itself is a habit for which smoking is good. You know, and that's why it's hard to quit smoking. You know, if you just thought, okay, it's bad for me, I just don't do it, it would be easy, but that is because it wouldn't be a habit. If it is a habit, it's actually hard because the habit takes over and wants to carry on. So habits generate values, and these values are non-metabolic. And people like Merleau-Ponty have already said that there is this concept of motor intentionality that is a consequence of how we organize our actions and how the body organizes itself. And that puts us in a sort of relation to the world where there are optimal distances, for instance, to appreciate a particular object of vision, or the beginning of an act already just tells us very much about what's going to happen next. You know, the beginning of a pointing gesture is already part of the pointing, and it's pointing to the pointing in this case. So, but you can survive. I mean, the point here is that you can survive without this, organically speaking. You know, I need water, and I can drink water in a very funny way, dangerous, like picking up the glass like this and doing a kind of movement and drink the water. But I don't do that. I mean, I just have a preferred way of handling objects, like picking up a glass. And these preferred ways are part of habits. So, I think I mentioned okay. I need to mention this, sorry. This is an insect, the water boatman, who can trap air bubbles and go underwater and breathe by using the oxygen contained in the air bubbles and creating a difference of partial pressures with the water such that the oxygen from the water flows into the bubbles. So as long as the insect can keep the bubbles from collapsing, they function like an artificial lung, right? I want to say with this that habits, you can call it a habit or something if you like, you know, the behavior can eventually affect the lower levels, for instance, metabolic levels. Because you can imagine this insect now looking for food underwater, finding new kinds of nutrients, having metabolic pathways that become atrophied, that's the word, yeah, because they are not used, and so on. And eventually, depending for survival on finding these nutrients underwater. So something that becomes behavior can change the conditions of life that give rise to this behavior. So the picture that I told you about this closure, this operational closure, I would like to now start opening up this idea a little bit and put it in time. So instead of having a circle that fits back on itself, that is perfect, you may have something that is actually not quite perfect, but at the moment there is a kind of relation of dependencies between these processes, but it's not perfectly close on itself. It's a circle with some gaps. But that circle has a kind of permanence, even if it is transient, for a few minutes or a few hours, a few days. And in that state, it can still regulate and interact with the world in such a way that you may close back whatever you don't have. The behavior may actually provide the closure that is not there. And so that's why, that's what we do actually. We need food, so we eat. And it's not the case that because we need food, we are actually not alive while we're not eating, right? But if we don't eat, if we don't behave in certain ways, we won't survive. So we're not fully closed on ourselves. We will need to do something before the end of the day or before the end of the week if we want to carry on being what we are. So why is this important? Why is this interesting? Because I think that if you were building up a picture of what I was saying as something that goes in a kind of a layer approach, at first you have metabolism, then you have agency and more sophisticated forms of agencies and animality and social, and so on and so on. Some kind of a layer of like a cake, and you build things on top of each other. What I want to suggest is actually that that's not the right picture. The picture, yes, you have to start somewhere, so you start at the bottom, but the thing is that as soon as you move up one layer, that layer starts to feed back on the original one. For instance, by behaving, you can liberate several constraints on your metabolism, and then you can just start feeding on something else by just being able to move about. And so your metabolism that had to be of a very particular kind, now it has some freedom to change or drift in its structure. And this is the title of the talk in the end. We come to the title of the talk, How Mind Shapes the Body. Because the thing is, habits, this idea of habit is crossing the personal subpersonal domain both ways. A habit is something that I do as a person, but it's also something that has consequences for my metabolism and my brain and so on. So it's shaping me. Every time I do something, it changes me a little bit. And because they introduce their own normativity, it may well be that my underlying levels, my metabolism, can start to depend on these higher levels. I mean, so if you have a preference for certain kinds of food, eventually you might have to depend on that kind of food. Or an example that we wrote in that chapter with Marika and Hannah, a case where a patient needs to be given a drug that is actually quite hard and can be poisonous for normal people, but you give them slow doses of that drug in order to survive, and it gets adapted to it, and eventually so much adapted to it that it needs it to carry on living. Here you have something that a particular behavior, in this case very much directed towards the physiology, I admit, a particular behavior has changed the physiology where the value of an encounter, taking the drug, has changed from being a poison to being a nutrient, if you want to call it like that. So it seems that mind can get, therefore, reinscribed in the body, that the habit is a mutual translation between the psychic and the somatic. And of course, this applies, of course, to the social aspect as well. I mean, Richard Lewontin and Richard Levins, in their recent book of essays, they claim, our physiology is a social physiology. That depends very much on the class, the kind of work that you do, etc., etc. Now, in interaction, you may have the same kind of situations. There can be habits of interactions. I can go into that if later in the discussion. There are some examples of habits of interaction, including music improvisation, but many others too. Another example of how behavior can change our physiology is this case of underwater vision in children in Pacific Islands, where they dive to search for things. And they made a study recently that these children they have perfect vision underwater. They can read a book underwater if they want to. Whereas, Western children you know, you see, well, you have a blurry vision underwater. So, you know, your action changes your physiology and your anatomy. It turns out that actually what I have is, they changed the diameter of the crystal. I can't remember what it is, but the thing is, the behavior shapes the body. And to go, yeah, I wanted to suggest that human perception, coming back to what we said about human perception, is not a special case when we think about perceiving an abstract object. I mean, seems to be like the departure point of many theories of perception. It's like, oh, imagine how do you know that you're looking at this red cube and so on. That's actually so abstract. In this view, an animal will never perceive a shape like this in its abstractness. It will just perceive it in its value. Does it have any food content? Is it any dangerous? Then otherwise, I don't care about it. So I would like to say that what makes us perceive objects in their abstraction is a very high-level human capability. You know, it's a form of second nature. You know, where you could pick up a baby and show him, you know, little abstract things. And I want to highlight this part of the picture where the baby is actually being pushed to see certain things, which takes me to the final speculation of the talk, which is the idea of the social invisible. The social invisible being interpersonal processes that do not happen at the interpretative level, not at the level of, oh, I realize that you're looking at me, or I realize that you want this, not at the intentional level, but actually below that level. They can result in different forms of coordination that may fit into interpretation, but what they do is actually shape the body in this way that habits do. I was going to say something about wasn't ready. Well, I can come back to that, actually. It's not that central. But the thing is that this social invisible is like this network of social coordination is quite alive in a metaphorical sense, perhaps, and quite clever. It's not necessarily something that happens attached to an author, to someone who's doing it, but it just happens. And you can cite the work of sociologists like Marcel Mauss, you know, who wrote this very interesting essay on techniques of the body. I can't remember the date. It's like the 30s, 20s? I don't know. And more recent sociological studies like Loïc Baquan on a kind of an embedded sociological study of becoming a boxer. You know, how the institution trains you to move in certain ways, to breathe in certain ways, and so on, through institutionalized manners. So this ties in with a certain movement in phenomenology, going from a phenomenology of experience in intentional structure towards a phenomenology of the invisible. And that happens here with Merleau-Ponty first, and he has this book called The Invisible and the Invisible, with this concept of the flesh. The conditions that are underlying our possibilities of experiencing, but themselves are a form of self-affection that is not intentional. It's a kind of thing as, you know, something that bottoms out the possibilities of experience. A sort of Maine de Biran talks about the sense of effort. It's not about the sense of effort is not about something or anything. It's not an intention. It's an underlying aspect of experiences that is telling me that I am an experiencing being, that I am this active self. So yes, okay, well, we can come back to that. And there's a very nice study, again, of this social invisible, sociological study. You find this in sociology mostly. Breathing like a soldier. It speaks about the differences between normal breathing and the breathing requirements of a soldier that has to, you know, a soldier has to, for instance, be able to run for miles and miles and miles and miles, being able to stop and shoot, and therefore the breathing cannot be too agitated. And they have, at the same time, they have to be able to shout orders very loudly and clear so that everyone will listen to them. So this sociologist underwent this training, and notice exactly how this training happened. And so they would ask a cadet to lead a little platoon and say, well, you know, give some orders, and the orders couldn't be heard because it didn't shout from the bottom of the stomach or something. And then they would stop her and say, like, look, you know, this is what you have to feel. And they would push, you know, shout now, and they push the bottom of the stomach and say, like, you feel that? That's how you have to feel when you're shouting. And so how direct that intervention is, you know, it's a social intervention that is not telling you like, oh, imagine this or that. It's like pushing your body and creating that experience directly. And then you realize like, oh, this is what I have to feel. Okay, I'll do it. So that is what I talk about what I mean by this social invisible. It's not an interpretation that I'm making. It doesn't happen at the cognitive level. It happens at a direct embodied intervention level. So the whole thing is that most of phenomenology and of most cognitive science thinks that, you know, or have moved from this idea of me first, I can do things, to then extend that idea to the others, like I can towards him, or she can towards me, or we can, they can, all that. But I want to suggest that actually this might be either going both ways, or more radically, going just one way first. You know, that idea, that social builds up my own experience as a possibility of self-affection, my own possibilities of self-affection. More examples of the social invisible, ways in which you carry a baby about, ways in which you expose it to different forms of contacts with others and the world, and so on. So we can leave this to the discussion, the distinction between habits and skills, because it probably will come up. Yes, and that too. So just wanted to say that in this view, again, highlight the fact that mind is relational. It's neither inside or outside. That also has to do with the relation to extended mind ideas, and I don't want to go into that, but there is kind of, interestingly, that there is not a layer approach from the inside outside, but the you know, arrows flow in both ways. So just final message, recapitulate a little bit when we were talking about shallow embodiment, things like functionalism, like the extended mind, they do provide interesting ideas about the body, but these do not focus on the blind spots that would really, you know, if we do focus on the blind spots, we really make a difference and progress. And then that motivates this movement towards the body as precarious source of significance, which is the whole point of the enactive approach at different levels. It's the same point many times. And this is why the enactive approach can provide this, you know, it's trying to focus on those questions and provide definitions of agency, value, sense-making, social interaction, and so forth. And that leaves us with, you know, of course, lots of open challenges. You know, understanding habits and skills, as you already said, that habits is such a rich concept that it's very hard to pin it down, but it's possible. Understanding intersubjectivity, understanding this notion of a social flesh, or of the social invisible, as well as the typical challenges of understanding higher forms of mediation and higher forms of cognition. That's also a challenge for the enactive approach, you know, understanding what makes a human self. So, but I think I'll stop there because it's too much, and yeah, thank you.